minutes giving a very quick introduction to Climate Assembly UK and some of the recommendations, particularly those that speak to behaviour change, though I would say actually the majority of them do. Next slide, please. So for those not familiar with citizens' assemblies, these are increasingly used by policymakers and governments as a way of understanding informed public preferences. So they go beyond things like surveys and polls, which we often use to get a bit of a sense of what the public think about different policies and issues, and provide information to the public and allow them to deliberate on that and then they come up with recommendations. Climate Assembly UK was the first UK-wide citizens' assembly on climate change, and it was commissioned by 6 select committees of the House of Commons to look at the question of how the UK should reach its legally binding target of net zero emissions by 2050. And it chose to use a citizens' assembly because, as we've already heard, there are going to be profound impacts on people's lifestyles, on their behaviour and decision-making of reaching net zero. So it's important to find out what they think about these changes and involve them in that decision making. Very briefly, there were 108 Assembly members who were recruited through a rigorous process of sampling to ensure a representative sample of the UK population in terms of age, gender, income, geography, and levels of concern about climate change. And they met over 6 weekends in 2020 to learn about a range of issues to do with net zero, consider them and make some recommendations. Next slide, please. And so if you look at the report, it's a very long report, you'll see that we covered a whole range of issues around how to get to net zero. So really all the main sort of areas of policy. We started off by looking at principles, and then we moved on to travel, energy use in the home, consumption, energy supply, and so on. And I will, next slide, please, give you a bit of a flavour of some of the things that came out of those discussions and recommendations now. Next slide, please. Just before I go into some concrete examples, I thought it would be useful to draw out some of the main themes that came out across all of those very diverse topics. And I would say that all of these themes say something about how we can design effective and acceptable behaviour change policies to reach net zero. So the first theme was really around fairness. This was something they defined themselves. This is about thinking about different levels of income, people working in different sectors, people in different regions and so on, and ensuring that certain groups are not unfairly disadvantaged by a transition to net zero. The second one is around making use of co-benefits of a transition to net zero. In other words, additional benefits for local high streets, the economy, one's health, biodiversity, and so on. So in other words, not only cutting emissions, but also making our lives better. Next, there was the importance of freedom and choice to be maintained as far as possible, but also linked to that, ensuring that we had much better information and education to inform our decision-making and consumers' decision-making to ensure that they were choosing lower carbon options. And very strong leadership from government was regularly emphasised as well, so that there was a feeling that consumers and individual citizens would be willing to act if they were a part of a collective action, that government, business and others were part of that collective action as well. Next slide, please. So I don't have time to go into lots of detail, but just to pick out a few examples of the sorts of behaviour change and wider policies that were supported. So for example, within surface travel, you can see that there was support for a future that didn't place too much restriction on how much we travel. There was support for localization, so building communities in ways that did reduce the amount of travel that we needed to make, but much stronger support for shifting to electric vehicles, so and by choosing those lower carbon vehicles, and also shifting to lower carbon modes of travel, public and active modes. To take another example on the what we eat and how we use the land, which is the one I was most closely involved with, there was a very strong support for reducing meat and dairy consumption within our diets that came out there actually, as well as support for local production of food, support for farmers as well to make those transitions, those behaviour changes that we just heard about. And again, we see not disproportionately affecting the least well off coming out in a number of ways. Next slide, please. Maybe just to take one more example from the what we buy topic, here there was again support not only for changing what business do to ensure that products are lower carbon and producing using more efficient processes, but also to repair and share products more, so support for the sort of so-called circular economy. So there's significant behaviour changes required there. But again, the importance of information in informing that decision making to ensure we buy lower carbon products. Again, happy to talk in lots more examples and details in the discussion. I think next slide, please. But yeah, just to emphasise, I think that throughout the report, you'll see there are lots of behaviour changes, behaviour change policies that are given a lot of support. But what's really interesting, I think, is the conditions under which those policies are seen as more acceptable. And those conditions I've mentioned already in terms of fairness, for example, showing strong leadership from government and business and so on. So I think there's a huge resource here to inform effective behaviour change policy making. Thanks.